Hi, everybody. I'm super excited. Thank you so much in advance for your time today, especially if you are in Berlin. It's beautiful outside, so thank you for being inside, unless you're magically outside on your computer, which kudos to you. So I am super passionate actually about this particular topic, and I apologize in advance. You're going to hear my dog barking because he's a monster sometimes. So I'm so sorry for the background music. But yes, I'm particularly passionate about this topic because I feel like it's pretty tough, and it's can be a little bit difficult to navigate. So I wanted to shed some light on it based on my previous experiences, and kind of get the conversation started. So I think there's a lot of innovation that comes in this space. So without further ado, can everybody see my screen? Can I just get a thumbs up? Okay, or nod? Yeah, okay, perfect, awesome, cool, great. So as we mentioned today, I'm gonna be trying to talk about measuring the impact of user research in an organization. It's going to be a pretty short talk. I have my timer readily available, but I will try and get through as much content as possible. Some of the content in the beginning may be a little bit high level and vague, but I promise I'm going to bring through some actual concrete examples towards the end. So hopefully we can put it into context for everybody. So just really quickly, my photo is huge on my desktop right now, so I apologize if like a huge photo of my face just popped up, but my dog is there. That's the one who's barking in the background. He's Poncho. And just some random fun facts about me to make me human, since I am on the other side of a computer. I love World of Warcraft and Pokemon. Video games are life for me. I brought my 2 cats, who you won't hear probably, and my dog Poncho from America to Germany. Each of them had their own separate flight, so that was very interesting. I actually write fiction novels, psychological thrillers in some of my spare time, and similar to that, I love watching scary movies, even if I can't sleep afterwards. And then I tried out for a Broadway musical called Annie when I was really young, and I actually got called back, and I don't know how, because I suck at singing. So I think they just felt bad for me because I was young and obviously scared. And so I am currently based in Berlin right now, from America, obviously. And I currently work as a senior user researcher at Zalando. If you aren't familiar with Zalando, it is an fashion platform, e-commerce, and I highly recommend you check them out. Cool. So for today, our agenda is a little bit sparse, but that's just because I'm trying to get through as much as possible in a small amount of time. But as mentioned, feel free to kind of write in the chat and write any messages that come up or any questions that come up during the presentation. Feel free to write them and we'll go over them later. But for today, we're going to go over business KPIs and frameworks, which sounds kind of dry and boring, but I'll try to make it fun. And then we'll go over some internal KPIs that you can use to help track the impact of research in your own organization. And then we'll go over an example, as I mentioned, to kind of try and bring that all together. I'm going to use a fake example, so I'm not going to use any sort of data from any of the companies that I've worked at, but hopefully it will all make sense. Cool, so let's get started. Before we begin, what is a KPI and what is ROI? So when I first heard these, I was just very confused. And I was kind of like, I don't know acronyms. I don't know business that well. I'm not interested. It's not UXR, which means that I don't care. However, I found that understanding businesses in general and understanding the different nuances and the different ways that businesses think is a super important part of user research, because ultimately as user researchers, we are here to be a service and to empower the teams in the business and to actually help the business succeed and grow. So I hate saying this, but it's a little bit true, is that ultimately everybody cares about money and businesses care about money. And so it's very important that we take into consideration how much money people are spending on research and how much money research is giving back to an organization. So for instance, as a researcher, we get paid a salary, and hopefully we're researching areas and topics that would cause more customers to come and stay on a product and pay more money to that organization over time. So just to kind of get that out there, business is a very important part of user research, especially as you grow in your career. So understanding things like KPIs and ROI are very, very important. So the way that I'm going to explain a KPI is that it's essentially a metric that helps us measure the success of a goal. So imagine for some reason you want to run a marathon, and I applaud anybody who is doing this because that's not easy. So a marathon is 42 kilometers just about. And so you can have that as your goal, right? But likelihood is, unless you're super person, you aren't going to go out and run 42 kilometers all in one try on your first try and say, there, I ran a marathon, all good, goal check, off my to-do list. Now I'm on to Iron Man or Iron Woman. So normally what we do is we have to take smaller steps to success. And that's kind of what a KPI is. So it's a metric that shows us how successful we are in achieving our goal. So if you think about running a marathon, you can think of different metrics such as your distance, how far you're running. So you can track how far you're running and how that improves over time. You can track your speed. When I started running, I did walking, but I did like 5 minutes of walking and, 3 minutes of running. And so, I slowly was able to get up and start actually running and being faster. And so that's another way to track your success towards running this marathon. And then you have other metrics that you can use, like heart rate. So hopefully your heart rate is going down. And also you can use like recovery. So how long it takes your body to recover from a longer run. So those are several metrics that help us understand how successful we are in getting towards our goal, and small measures of success. And as you notice, you don't just measure one. We can measure distance, but I could go out and run I could go out and walk 42 kilometers, but it would take me days, so if I didn't also measure time, then I'm not sure how successful I actually am in running this marathon. So it's important to measure multiple KPIs and multiple metrics when we're thinking about an overall goal. And I promise I will relate this to UX, but first, we're going to talk about running. So that's kind of what a KPI is. Again, it's an indicator and a metric that allows us to measure how successful we are in reaching our goal. And then return on investment, which is ROI, is actually similar to what I was saying before. Is a company invests in you as a researcher, and they want a return on that. So they want, yes, we pay your salary, but what you do is you help improve the product, and you help us innovate so that we can in turn make more money. And so if we think about the marathon, you invest time, energy, and effort into this marathon. But what you get out of it is a huge sense of accomplishment. You might form really great running habits. You might be in better health than you were before. It might help you kick bad habits that you had. You might make a lot of friends from it. So generally, we want the return on investment to be equal or more. So yes, you spent the time and the effort, but look at all of these amazing things that you got out of it. Or you figured out that you hate marathons and you never do it again, but at least you did it. So just to get those two out of the way, that's kind of how I think about those two key words or key sorry, my dog is so annoying right now. Those two key phrases in business. So keep those in mind kind of as we're talking about these next few slides. So first we're going to go over the super fun business KPIs. And then we're going to talk about two frameworks that are very common frameworks that you can use to measure impact of user research across an organization. So business KPIs. These are things that are important to your business. So unfortunately, there's no cookie cutter template for coming up with what are the best business KPIs that you should be tracking. Ideally, your business strategists or anybody who is involved in the business strategy will have an idea of what KPIs the business is looking at. So it's really important to understand what your business is trying to accomplish. So as a user researcher, you can go into, let's say Zalando, like an e-commerce company, and you can say, well, you know, I don't really think that the catalog page of clothing makes sense. I think we should completely rethink it. And I think that we should come up with a new and innovative way to show a catalog of clothing. And we should swipe and do new interactions, and people should be able to try on the clothing virtually. Like, all those things sound really cool, right? And really awesome. Like, I would love to work on projects like that. But if they aren't aligned with your business strategy, then your research will not be used ultimately. So what you do need to understand when you go into a business is something like e-commerce, which is pretty straightforward, is there are really important KPIs such as conversion rate, right? We want users to be able to buy something. We want users to be able to click through the different steps in order to buy something. We want people to come back. We want loyalty. We want people to spend some time browsing, and we want people to download our app if we have one. And we want people to have good experiences, because then they share their good experiences with others. And then we get things like good ratings. So when you start at a company, or if you've been in a company and you're just not sure about the business KPIs, I highly recommend you talking to somebody who would have an understanding of what these business KPIs are. The ones that I put here on this slide to the right, they're pretty basic, high level, like safe assumptions that you are tracking as a company generally. Of course, if you are a B2B company, these may not be as relevant for you, but in terms of B2C, these kinds of KPIs are usually what B2C companies are tracking. And they're a really, really good way for us to, as user researchers, take these business KPIs and actually think about how our research could potentially impact them. So I'm going to take the first one as an example. You have conversion rate, right? So a really great research question for this, when you would use conversion rate, is determine the usability of a checkout flow. So a product manager or a designer comes to you and they're like, hey, listen, like, something's a little bit wonky with our checkout flow. You know, people are kind of dropping off at page 2 out of 3, and it's not going super well. Our conversion rate is dropping a little bit. You know, what should we do? We see it in the analytics, but we have no idea what's actually going wrong. So this is a great way to say, okay, great. So let's do some usability tests, and let's see if then we can come up with what happened during the checkout flow, what's going wrong. And then we measure the conversion rate and see if it's improved after we do our user research, and then we enact the changes of the user research. So essentially, then what happens is you take conversion rate from what it was before you do the research. You do the research, you have the designer, this is the key part, you have the designer actually design the changes that you found and the problems that you found. And then you have developers develop it, and then you push it out live and then see the impact on the conversion rate. So what's really great here is if in fact it is a usability based issue, so you find usability issues, say people are unable to click the next button or find the next button, or there's an error that keeps occurring for people, and you fix the usability issue, generally the conversion rate will then go up. And you can show people, hey, you know, like this is what research can do. You know, we're not just here to give you quotes and video clips of people, we're also here to impact these business KPIs and these very, very important metrics that get us money and ultimately make our business successful. So that's kind of the rundown of business KPIs. I would highly recommend at the beginning of every research project, try to find out which KPIs you could potentially be impacting with your research. So under each one of these KPIs, I put a sample research question, like the usability of the checkout flow, signing up for a newsletter, discovering if product or features help people, assessing the quality of search results, and then finally identifying the value a product brings to a user. So all of these are very valid research questions and very valid research studies. And 100% you can choose these business KPIs and measure them before you do the research and then after you do the research. And I have done this several times in the past, and it's been really, really successful. The truth is you don't always see a change, and that's okay. It's especially okay as long as things don't get worse. You don't really want to be doing the research and then changing things and then they get worse. That's not ideal. However, a good thing is that you're tracking these, and so you can see if they do in fact get worse, and kind of stop and reassess what happened. But again, these won't always change drastically. You might see very incremental changes. However, it's just, there are some times where the impact is big, and it's definitely worth always looking into these and always trying to take the research question and bring it back to whatever business KPIs you can. Cool. So these are very common metrics as well. They're called the pirate metrics, R metrics. And I really highly recommend looking into these if you're struggling. I know a lot of, so when I was at my previous company as a researcher, I was working across acquisition and retention in particular. So I was definitely looking up like what are the best acquisition and retention metrics that we could be tracking as a team, and always trying to take those metrics and put them into my research plans. So whenever I would start a study, or have a product manager come to me or a designer come to me, I would be like, okay, cool, let's formulate the question, the goals, and then let's also talk about what metrics we'll be tracking. And these will let us know how successful we were. So yeah, I highly recommend these. I put a little source here, and it goes to a really, really great Medium article that explains the R metrics. I always want to sound like a pirate when I say that, but it just comes out awkwardly. Cool. So going right along to frameworks. So I'm sure that many of you have heard about the HEART framework. If you haven't, that's fine, because it took me a very long time to learn about that after I got into the field of user research. And then there's a lesser known one called the PURE framework. So these are two very commonly used frameworks across the industry that help us measure the impact of user research over time. The first one, the HEART framework, the reason that this is significantly more popular than the second one is because it was created by Google. And everybody knows everything that Google does. So essentially what this framework does is it helps teams focus on specific aspects of the UX to improve. So what's cool about this is you have 5 different areas to focus on: goals, and then metrics within each of those 5 areas. And we'll go over each of these in detail in a second. And then the second one is Pure Framework. This is actually by Capital One, who has a killer user research team. And I was like, a bank and user research, crazy. But they do a really great job at user research. And this framework is a little bit different, and it measures how difficult or easy something for a user is to do over time. So a given task or experience is. And this also measures progress over time when it comes to like tasks or flows or experiences. So let's dive in first to the HEART framework. I'm going to go over this one a little bit more quickly because I feel like it's more popular. But as you can see here, you have HEART framework, and HEART stands for happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, and task success. So this is very similar. Like you can use like the R metrics, like adoption, acquisition, retention, etc. as well for these kinds of areas to look into. But Google happens to use these 5. If you're just starting out with trying to track this over time, this framework is a great place to start. So let's take happiness, for example. You set a goal, a signal, and a metric for each area. So happiness, and the way that you set, let's start with goals. The way that you set goals, a great question to ask yourself is, what would we want a customer to tweet after using the product? So for happiness, what would we want them to tweet about if they could say something? And quite frankly, I would agree that in happiness, I would want somebody to say, I find the app helpful, fun, and easy to use. That's a really great indication of happiness. So I would use that question when trying to come up with a goal for each of these areas. Signals are actions done by the user, essentially, that would indicate whether people find something enjoyable to do, and whether the goal is true. So for instance, here, if you see happiness, if you find an app, so think of an app that you love. I have one that actually I used to love. It was called Wunderlist. And then it got taken over by Microsoft. And like, it's essentially the same thing, but for some reason, just having the name Microsoft on it made me really angry. And so it's slightly different, and it has slightly different things than what Wunderlist had. But Wunderlist made me very happy because it allowed me to track my to-dos in a very easy, straightforward way. And so when they would ask me, those like annoying pop-ups that are like, how would you rate this app? And you're like, fuck, cancel, like get me out of this. I actually responded to them. I mean, I have some user research guilt, but, and I have to respond to a lot of surveys. I feel the need to, but I responded to their surveys. I wanted to give feedback. I wanted to give 5-star reviews. So if people are happy, they are more likely to respond positively to your app. This also works on the opposite side. So you also have to look at the quality of what you're getting. So yes, people can respond to surveys and they can respond to ratings, but if they're leaving 1-star ratings, that's probably a good indication that they're not happy. So just make sure that you just don't say leaving ratings. You want to specify like leaving 4 or 5-star ratings. And these are, again, signals or actions that the user can take to prove that they are happy with the app for this particular goal. And then finally, assigning metrics. This is similar to what we were talking about before. So you can actually use business KPIs that we were discussing before as these metrics. So in terms of happiness, they have net promoter score, customer satisfaction rating, and then the number of 5-star reviews. You could also go into the opposite side and say the number of 1-star reviews and hope that it decreases over time. And you can look and see if the number of 5-star reviews increase over time. So these are just different ways that you can kind of look at and measure whether or not people are actually happy. So if people are leaving more 5-star reviews, if your satisfaction rates are higher, then people are generally happy with what they're doing. So you can kind of look at some of these, also incorporating some of these really important business KPIs. It's more difficult for abstract things like happiness. So you might find it easier to apply these business KPIs to like engagement or adoption or retention, because it's like retention would be like return rate, adoption would be download rate as they have here, engagement is session length, and conversion rate. So happiness is a little bit of a tough one, but engagement, adoption, and retention, or anything along those R metrics, will be easier to apply the business KPIs to. So that's the Google Heart framework. I really highly recommend it if you're just starting out. It's pretty simple to set up, and they have some really great examples online just about the framework. This one is a little bit, the Pure framework is a little bit different. This is more so if you think about usability testing. So imagine that you're going through a usability test and you have a series of tasks that you're asking your user to complete. And as you can see here, here's an example. You're asking somebody, how would they download something? Great. How would you install this? How would you create an account? How would you enroll? And you're going through and you're asking the participants to complete these tasks. And what you're essentially doing is you're rating the amount of ease or difficulty that a user has on each task. So as you can see here, green is 1, and this is easy, like an easy task that somebody can do. Yellow is like, oh, there's some effort that I have to put in, but I can still do it. And then you have red. This task is difficult, and some people might either give up or fail on the task. So what you can do is across participants. So I will take the browser extensions as the best example because it has 6 participants, which obviously we want more than just 2 participants, but it has 6 participants here. So for each of these different tasks, you would rate how easy or difficult it was for a user to do it. And then each task gets a score, and then you actually get a total score for the entire usability test, which is really, really cool, and a really great way to look at as a whole. This is how our product is working, and this is how each task is working. And then if you're able to make improvements, what you can do is you can actually track then the improvements, the improvements for each task, and then also the improvements for the overall experience. One second, I am just going to close my door really quickly. Okay, that should be better. Cool. So yeah, as I mentioned, each task will be measured, and you can measure how much improvement is happening, and then you can measure the usability test as a whole. So for instance, if you were to run one usability test a usability test and get this score of 38, and then you make improvements to it based on the findings, and you run it again, and you get a better score, which would be a lower score because we want most of these to be 1s, and you get a lower score that can show, hey, look, we did the research, we found these important things, and this is the changes that we made, and this is how it improved over time. Cool. Awesome. So, great. So now we're going to actually go into breakout rooms. And sorry, my animals, it's like a zoo in here today. So now we're going to go into breakout rooms right now. This will be for just 5 minutes. And I would love for each of you to talk about what you've heard so far, how you currently measure the impact of user research or UX in your company or in a past company. Or if you had a friend who has also done this before. Have you used one of the frameworks that has been mentioned? And then which framework would you like to try at your company, and how would you do this? So I'm actually going to go ahead and, but I promise I will be quick for the rest of the time. So I'm going to go ahead and share this. I wanted to talk now a little bit more about internal team KPIs. So this is kind of trying to understand the impact of user research across an organization. And I would love if you do this already at your organization, if you could share some of yours in the chat, some of the ways that you actually track the impact of user research at an organizational level. So it's really great if you're doing evaluative research, like usability testing, and you're picking metrics that make sense. So for instance, if you are at a B2C company, you're doing e-commerce and you're tracking things like conversion rate over time, and you see it going up because your designs are getting, the designs and the experience are getting better. That's fantastic. However, there is also a way to, which is very important, measure kind of how user research works across an organization, and the general impact of user research and user research maturity that you have at an organization at an organizational level. So some of the ways that I actually, and these are all, this entire topic is something that needs to be developed further in terms of our field and in our industry. You know, we should really be kind of constantly working towards finding ways to better find out how user research impacts an organization. So by all means, this is not the end. It's just kind of the beginning of figuring out how we can do this together as a community. But some of the internal KPIs that I look at are number of usability tests run, like in a quarter or in a year. This shows the interest in terms of user research, and kind of how mature an organization is. Then you have amount of time to research from a request. So assuming you get a request. So at Zalando, we get so many different requests, and sometimes quite a lot of time can go by before we're actually doing the research. So it's really important to track, like, and ideally that time kind of goes down over time as you start to operationalize some of these aspects, such as recruiting. But amount of time to research is actually an important one, because if people are putting in requests and you're not able to get to them for a few weeks, then it's kind of like, oh, okay, we need to do something about this, because then user research isn't going to be able to be impactful. The number of research requests that I get, I use this to determine you know, how interested people are in user research, the product managers, developers, designers, or any other of the departments. And then these three are these next three on the right here are also really important in terms of measuring the impact of user research. So the number of usability issues fixed. This is big. This kind of can show you over time the number of things that, yes, you found, but that were also then fixed. And this is where it becomes really, really important. Sorry, my cat is walking everywhere. This is really important because we do user research. Yes, that's great. If we just do it, then great, but we need it to actually be actioned on. Because user research will not be impactful if nobody feels like they can do anything about it. So as we want the number of usability issues fixed to go up over time. Then the number of features from user research onto a roadmap. This is a huge favorite of mine. If product and tech teams are using insights from research to create a roadmap, that's ideal. You know, that's when you can see that user research has really taken grip of an organization and is within people's mindsets, and the cultural change has kind of happened because you're seeing people who are like, okay, great, these findings are important. We're actually going to put them into a roadmap. We're going to plan to do these. And then finally, the number of generative research sessions run. This is similar to usability testing, but generative research is a much higher research maturity, because it's that discovery research that then can feed into features or products or innovative ideas into a roadmap. So to be completely honest, these three on the right are my favorite ones to track internally. And they kind of show me, you know, where an organization is with their user research and the importance that they place on it. So if you see that no features are going from user research insights onto the roadmap, user research is not going to be seen as impactful, because it just won't come to light any of what you're doing. So you really have to make sure that, you know, you're choosing these metrics and you're tracking them so that you can see, okay, cool, you know, these are the insights that came up. Where are they on the roadmap? And that shows like that maturity level, and it shows, hey, we did the research, we found these findings, and now they're so important that we're placing them on the roadmap. I'm going to quickly go, because I know that I only have 5 minutes. So I'm going to quickly go through an example. This is something that I actually use at my, I've used at previous companies before. I have not yet put it into practice at Zalando, but it's called the 3 E's framework. And then I put internal KPIs on this. So the 3 E's framework, it's a framework that I created that I pulled from various sources, such as the HEART framework and the PURE framework that we talked about, and I created 3 major components: ease of use, effectiveness, and emotional impact. Those are the 3 different E's. So if you look here, ease of use is kind of usability testing, like we talked about for the PURE method. So each task is measured as 1 to 3 in terms of how easy or difficult it is to complete, and each usability test is given a score. Effectiveness measures if a product is actually being effective for a user. So for this, I'd use metrics similar to the HEART framework and similar to the business KPIs that we talked about before, such as conversion rate, download rate, churn rate, renewal rate, number of sessions. And then finally, emotional impact is something also in this framework, and this is to measure emotions. So this is through qualitative interviewing. So you have quotes, observations like rage clicking. Like I've seen people who are like, I love this, and then they're like furiously tapping angrily on the screen, and I'm like, I'm not sure if you actually love it. You look pretty angry while you're interacting with it. You can also use metrics such as satisfaction surveys, and loyalty to determine emotional impact. And then finally, in addition to these 3 areas to look at, I then put internal KPIs on this project. So I'm going to just quickly go over the ease of use metrics, using time on task, number of errors, task completion, and then giving a score for each task from 1 to 3 on if somebody was able to complete it or not, the ease or difficulty that they went to. So an entire, just to be clear about what a task is versus a workflow, an entire workflow is like a checkout flow, and a task is something like fill out this form. So each task gets a score, and then they are all added up to give the overall workflow a score. Effectiveness, as I mentioned before, I usually choose 3 per project, and this is metrics like the HEART metrics, or business KPIs. And then we have emotional impact, as I mentioned, surveys such as satisfaction surveys, trends and quotes from qualitative interviews, and observations during usability testing. And then internal KPIs, I love to, as I mentioned, number of usability issues fixed, and then number of features put onto the UX roadmap. So this is just a really quick overview of like understanding a checkout flow, just to kind of bring it all together. Like, so this is how I would think about this. Is if somebody comes to me, one of my colleagues or internal stakeholders comes to me and is like, hey, I need to understand better how people are going through a checkout flow, since we're having some sort of drop in click-through rate, conversion rate, some sort of issue. So I would then go ahead and create a research plan, and I would you kind of put in the 3E framework to this. So I would decide on a usability test, so ease of use, and then I would decide on success metrics such as effectiveness, such as what we talked about before, like the business KPIs, and then look at internal KPIs. So for instance, for something like a checkout flow, I would assign tasks like, okay, how would you fill out your shipping address, your billing address, your payment information? How would you check out? And so go through that entire flow and see if people were able to complete that or not. And then look at things like if the conversion rate beforehand and then the conversion rate after we make those changes. And then internal KPIs alongside that. So that's kind of what I would include in a research plan. And then the research is finished, the teams analyze the results. So you see essentially a low task completion percentage, let's say, a high number of errors, and you make the changes, and then you continue to monitor the effectiveness of the changes. So for instance, hopefully the conversion rate goes up. Hopefully the click-through rate will go up based on the changes that you made. And then you can use those internal KPIs. Like, is the team then putting, like, they made those changes, are they going to put additional changes on the roadmap that would improve the user experience even more, and improve the feature even more beyond that. So that is kind of how I would put that together in terms of a checkout flow. The 3 E's framework that I came up with is it's really effective, actually, in breaking down, hey, this is almost the usability testing portion of it. This is the success metrics and the business KPIs, and then these are the internal KPIs that we're going to look at. So since I have a very, 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 very limited amount of time to go through this, this is kind of just an overview. But again, I'm happy to kind of answer any questions, or either tonight or any follow-up questions that you have in general after the fact. Because again, I could talk about this for like 3 hours as opposed to just less than 1. So thank you all very much. Let me see what we're going to do in terms of questions and social time. So yes. Whew.
So I was thinking we could maybe make use of the next 10 minutes to go through any questions, and then we use the rest of the time to socialize, if everyone is happy with that. Of course, we do understand we ran a bit out of time, but I think it was really great that Nikki tried to finish the entire presentation, or the majority of it. So yeah, please stick around for the Q&A for the next 10 minutes. I think, like, I keep an eye on the time, and then we officially close it, and then we can socialize a bit more. But thanks already. So yeah, I think we should do it like that. Please paste your questions into the chat. I'm gonna read them out to Nikki, and then yeah, this way I hope we can answer all the questions. And I'll start maybe with the first one, which was, would the goal signals be equivalent to leading or lagging metrics?
Sorry, would they be, say that one more time.
So would the goals and signals, I think it referred to the HEART framework,
yeah,
be the equivalent to leading or lagging metrics?
That's Anton, yeah. Anton, if you're still on the call, I would love to hear about what leading, lagging metrics are, because I actually don't know what they are. So I'm not sure if I can answer that.
It's from the Hoshin framework. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so that's basically, my question was, you actually looking into how KPIs are measured?
Yep.
And if you're using leading measures versus lagging measures, is this something you can match in the HEART framework? That was the question.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm to be completely honest, not a super expert on leading versus and lagging metrics, so I don't think that I can answer that question.
That's okay. It's very technical.
Yeah,
I think I'm going towards already making the connection to business KPIs in a much closer sense than your introduction was going. That's
sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I would of course recommend looking into that on your own, because the HEART framework is a really great introduction into this. And so I would also, in terms of when you talk about user research and business KPIs, I would keep it as simple as possible, to be honest, because people tend to get a little bit overwhelmed with kind of matching KPIs to user research, and it can then turn badly. if you try very hard to like make it more complicated than it needs to be. So that's kind of what I did when I went into this, is I made it pretty complicated. And then it worked against me because I saw that metrics were actually not moving, or they were going in the wrong direction. So then I kind of tried to simplify it as much as possible. But I would love to hear more about this at some point, Anton. It sounds interesting. Sorry, I can't answer more.
That's all right. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Okay, then we have got the next question from Heidi. What kind of tools do you use to track these metrics?
Yeah, so if you're talking about things like business KPIs, I generally will use something like Google Analytics for web. Firebase is a common one for mobile. So I use analytics platforms to track the metrics, any sort of analytics that you're using at your company, which ideally you are using something, or like Data Studio. When you're talking about usability metrics like time on task or task success, that's actually very manually done. So during a usability test, the person who's like note-taking or observing will actually be giving these grades of 1, 2, or 3 per task. It's very important that you speak with your team beforehand so you all agree on what is 1, 2, and 3. So what does it mean for somebody to do something easily? What does it mean for somebody to struggle a little bit? And what does it mean for somebody to completely fail or struggle too much? So that's all done very manually. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if there's a tool out there that kind of does all of this for you. I know that I've created and seen some pretty crazy spreadsheets, but generally it's done by an observer.
Yes. Yeah, I use Lookback, for example. You can do timestamp, or use timestamps for certain things. Then there's another question from Julia. How do you get the data from the teams whether the changes are successful?
So I generally always ask for access to these analytics and data so that I can track them on my own. I really don't go back to the team to ask them. Generally speaking, I will say a product manager is more than likely to be tracking these kinds of things, because that is generally part of their job, is to assign and track success metrics of a feature or a product. So I would be working closely with the product manager and any sort of analysts as well to ask them, hey, let's figure out what it is before we do the changes. And then, hey, afterwards, let's implement these changes, and then let's ask them after what it was and see the change. But I'm generally also have access to this, and so I'm monitoring them as time goes by. But definitely you can talk to the analysts on your team if you have any, or the product manager.
Okay. Then Tom has two questions, actually. It's related to how you devise your research plans. Do you need to develop assumptions about what you think might be keeping your KPIs where they are, and then go out and test? Or do your research questions come with their own assumptions?
Great question. Both. So you should always be kind of thinking about things you're on your own. Like, these are my assumptions that I have. And then you should always be talking and aligning with your stakeholders, because obviously your perspective is only one. And so when other people get into the group and they talk about their assumptions and what they think, that just broadens the picture that you have. So I never will just ask requesters to do it on their own. I will always then give my input as well. And this is for pretty much anything that has to do with research too. If you send somebody like a research plan to fill out, always help them through it, unless they're very, very well versed in user research. But Yes, I would say both the research requesters and you work together to come up with these assumptions, because, like, as I said, product managers and product analysts, they are the experts. You know, a product analyst is the expert in analysis. So, you know, you might say to them, hey, I think that we should be tracking something like conversion rate. And the product analyst is actually like, maybe conversion rate actually doesn't make sense for this research study. Maybe we can track another type. So as much as you can collaborate as a user researcher, the better. Because you're kind of pulling from all the different experts in your company and your organization. So I always default to looking towards experts, but also coming up with my own. I hope that was helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. Then Henrik has a question, which is regarding your work in Zalando. Who owns internal KPIs and makes sure they're being tracked? Is it a research leadership, or is it a shared responsibility of every researcher on the team?
So Zalando is huge. And so we have something called DX, which is digital experience, and it includes design as well as research. And so we have KPIs for that. We have... And leadership comes up with those KPIs. Within our research team, we have qual and quant, and our qual team, we match up with the digital experience KPIs. So we use the KPIs that were created by leadership to help us inform how we're prioritizing and what we should be tracking. So that's a really great question. I don't always think that that's the best way to do it. So I think that there are a multitude of ways that we can approach something like KPIs. And I think that having very high level ones is good for prioritization and helping us understand maybe which research request should come first. However, I also think that it's important for the team to either understand why those KPIs are getting tracked at a higher level or come up with their own. So in the case of Zalando, I can say that it's generally at a higher level, and leadership does create them. However, I've only been there for a month and 2 days, so I cannot say with expertise quite yet.
Okay. So we've got 3 more questions, and I think then we should wrap up the Q&A session. There is another one from Henrik in regards to ROI of research. How do you tie research spending back to P&L impact? Currently not sure what P&L is, but like every dollar invested in research will return X amount of dollars.
Yeah, so this is a little bit difficult to do exactly, and I think that this is where we can kind of innovate in the field a little bit more than we have so far. So this is where we can push it to the next level, because it's very hard to be able to say, you know, the company pays us X amount for our salaries, and this is the amount that we generate from research, because unfortunately research is that funny thing that doesn't have a direct impact, which is really annoying. But what we can do is I actually talk about the flip side, and I say, okay, if we don't do research on this, and the developers who you're paying X amount of money spend X amount of time doing this, and then it's wrong, and then they have to spend X amount of time redoing that, that's how much money we've just sunken in with if we don't do research. So I kind of, to be honest, it's a little bit shitty, put it in that sense, where I'm saying sunken cost instead of return, like the amount of revenue that we get from research. Because again, it's so hard to say exactly what research always impacts, because there's so many confounding variables going into these metrics. So I highly recommend thinking about it maybe the other way around and saying, if we don't do research, this is how much we can lose in money. It's kind of, and again, we should figure out a better way to do this as a research field, because that's a very like negative way of doing things. But yeah, I think that that's a great conversation opener and should continue moving forward.
Okay, cool. Thanks for answered. 2 more questions. Any thoughts on how KPIs or frameworks might be different for MVPs or apps in beta?
Yes. So anything that is in beta testing, I would be careful with assigning too many KPIs to it, since it's still new, I guess, and the usage will not be as regular or as standardized. I would look into, instead of like business KPIs when it comes to beta testing, I would look at usability, more of that usability side of things to see, okay, like, hey, this is how this is performing. Because first off, we need to get the usability right. Because if we don't do that, then nobody's going to come back. Nobody's going to use it. Nobody's going to download it. So generally during beta testing, you're still trying to figure out your product. You could ask people to rate your product based on what they've seen. So give like a preliminary rating over time. But again, that might not reflect the true nature of it when it's in the wild and live, because your beta testers might be, let's say, power users or very specific users. So I would stick to usability testing when it comes to that. And also, but you can look at things like how often people come, their return rate still, and session length, but really hone in on that usability for beta testing.
Okay, final question before we wrap up. I skipped one. How does the implementation of these frameworks happen in a company? Say it's not a UX mature company yet.
You got to start somewhere. So you will be the driving force then of this. So what I would recommend is taking something like the HEART framework, which is already kind of well defined and clearly has a very nice structure, and trying to fit that into your organization. So instead of trying to like do this like hero's journey of coming up with your own framework and all of these different moving parts, take something that already exists and then iterate on it based on your company. That's the best way to find how new things work. So for instance, when I came up with the 3 E's framework, that was because I tried both the HEART framework and the PURE method, and then ended up combining that and adding in internal KPIs. So something like that, something like the HEART framework, again, is very easy to kind of plug in numbers. If you're having trouble with the UX maturity, you can, again, and I hate to bring this up again, but you can bring up, hey, this is how much money we're losing if we don't do research. And the developers go through and develop something, the designers design something, and then they have to redo all of it because it's not working out. And then again, showing case studies of failed products like Google Graveyard, all of the failed products that happen kind of when you don't apply user research to them. There are all the case studies that happen when you don't apply user research to them, that can also help kind of push this forward. Like we should be tracking these things in our company, but really try and keep it as simple as possible when you're starting out and use an existing framework.
Okay, that was cool. Then I think Q&A is over. Thank you very much, Nikki. It was super interesting, especially the differentiation between return on investment and internal and external KPIs. I think it's really important to differentiate, and I actually also got a lot out of it. So thank you very much, and especially for the thorough answers at the end. And then, thanks to everyone who was sticking around through the talk and the Q&A.